For 43 years, Harold and I built a life together the way you build a good house, slowly, carefully, with attention to every joint and corner. We raised 2 children in our home in Orangeville, Ontario, watched them learn to ride bikes on the crescent out front, drove them to hockey practice at 5 in the morning without complaint, paid for university when we could barely afford it ourselves. We were not wealthy people, but we were steady. Harold drove for the regional school board for 30 years. I worked part-time at the library until I retired. We had our RRSP, a small TFSA. The house paid off by the time we were both 60. It wasn't much by some measures. By ours, it was everything. Our daughter Nora was the one I worried about, even before I had a reason to. She was the younger of the 2. Our son Philip had moved to Halifax after university, settled there, married a woman named June, who I liked immediately. They visited at Christmas and called on Sundays. There was nothing complicated about Philip. But Nora had always been different, sharper in some ways, harder in others. She could charm anyone in a room and then say something that cut right through you on the drive home. She married a man named Brett when she was 31. He had a loud laugh and expensive shoes and never once offered to help clear the table. I told myself I was being uncharitable. I told myself that for almost a decade, it started small, the way these things always do. Nora mentioned casually over the phone that she and Brett were having trouble with their mortgage. This was 2019, and they had bought a house in Barrie that was frankly too large for 2 people with no children. I said I was sorry to hear it. She said she wasn't asking for anything, she just wanted us to know. Then 2 weeks later, she asked if we could lend them $20,000. Just until Brett's commission came through. His company had restructured, and the timing was difficult. Harold and I talked about it for a long time at the kitchen table. We went back and forth. He was more hesitant than I was. I remember him saying, "Lorraine, I don't have a good feeling about this." I told him she was our daughter. We transferred the money. The commission came through, apparently. But the money never came back. When I brought it up 6 months later, Nora said she thought we'd agreed it was a gift. I knew we had not agreed to that. Harold knew it too. But there is a specific kind of paralysis that comes over you when your own child looks you in the eye and rewrites history. Because the alternative, that she is lying, deliberately to your face, is something your mind simply does not want to accept. So you file it away. You tell yourself there was a miscommunication. You move on. We moved on 4 more times over the next 3 years. There was the car loan. There was the dental bill that Brett needed covered because he'd let his benefits lapse. There was the time Nora said they were going to lose the house entirely, and could we please co-sign a line of credit at the bank? That one Harold refused. He said no, quietly and finally. And Nora didn't speak to us for 6 weeks afterward. When she came back, she acted as though nothing had happened. We were so relieved to have her back that we didn't push. I understand now how that looks from the outside. I do. But I want you to understand what it looks like from inside it. You are not dealing with a stranger. You are dealing with someone whose first steps you memorized, whose nightmares you sat up through, whose graduation you cried at. The pull of that history is not rational. It doesn't respond to logic. You keep finding reasons to believe the next time will be different. What I didn't know, what I had no idea about, was what had happened to my granddaughter's education fund. Nora and Brett didn't have children, but Philip did. He and June had a daughter, Abby, who was 7 at the time all of this was unfolding. When Abby was born, Harold and I had opened a registered education savings plan for her. We'd put money in every year quietly as our gift to her future. We'd added Nora as a secondary contact on the account at some point. I no longer remember exactly why, some administrative reason. And she had, at some point in the preceding 2 years, made withdrawals. I found out by accident. I called the financial institution to update our address after we'd talked about downsizing, and the woman on the phone mentioned the account balance. The number she said did not match what I expected. It was less than a third of what it should have been. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after I hung up. The furnace kicked on. The dog shifted under the table. Everything in the kitchen looked exactly the same as it always had, and I felt like I was sitting at the bottom of something very cold and very deep. I didn't tell Harold right away. I don't know why. I think I needed a few days to be sure I wasn't misremembering. I requested the full transaction history. When it came, I spread it out on the kitchen table and read through every line with a cup of tea that went cold beside me. The withdrawals were spaced out, never large enough in any single instance to trigger an automatic alert, spread over 14 months, methodical, careful. My daughter had stolen from her 7-year-old niece's education fund. I told Harold that night. We sat at the same kitchen table where we'd made every major decision of our adult lives, buying the house, deciding on the addition, talking about whether to help Philip with his down payment. And Harold didn't say anything for a long time. Then he said, "How long has she been doing this to us?" That question opened something in both of us, because the answer, when we actually sat down and tried to trace it, was that it had been going on in one form or another since the first year of her marriage to Brett, possibly before. We called Philip that weekend. He and June drove up from Halifax 2 weeks later. The 4 of us sat at the table together and went through everything we could document. Philip was quiet through most of it. June had tears running down her face when she understood what had happened to Abby's recipes. Philip's jaw was tight in the way it gets when he's trying very hard not to show how angry he is. He said, "Mom, did you know about any of this before now?" I said no. He looked at his father. Harold shook his head. There was a terrible silence, and then Philip said, "Okay, then we deal with it together." What we did not know then, what we only found out later, through the investigation that followed, was that Nora and Brett had also, at some point in the previous year, approached Harold's former colleague at the school board, a man named Gordon who had helped us set up our will, and represented themselves as acting with our permission to discuss the estate. They had been trying to find out what our assets were, what we had, and what it would be worth when we were gone. Gordon, bless him, had said nothing and called Harold immediately. Harold had not told me about that call. When I found out, sitting in our living room with Philip and June, Harold finally telling the full story, I looked at my husband and felt something shift that I cannot entirely describe. Not anger, something more like vertigo. Because what I realized was that Harold had been quietly investigating for months. He'd been calling Gordon. He'd been speaking to a lawyer. He'd been collecting information without telling me. And when I asked him why he hadn't said anything, he looked at me with this expression I will never forget and said, "Because I wasn't sure yet. And I didn't want it to be true any more than you did. We are both past 65. We are at the age where you think the hard surprises are mostly behind you. You've buried parents. You've had health scares. You've recalibrated what matters. You think you know who your people are." The following month was one of the hardest of my life. and I have had some hard months. We had to contact the financial institution about the Rispard. We had to consult with the lawyer about whether what Nora had done constituted fraud. It did. She had forged authorization. The lawyer was not gentle about describing what that meant. We had to make decisions about whether to pursue it formally. Philip wanted to. Harold was torn. I sat in the middle of all of it and tried to think clearly. There was a Sunday in March. I remember it was just starting to thaw. That particular gray, bright Ontario thaw where everything looks both worse and more hopeful than it did in February, when Nora called. She didn't know what we knew yet, or how much. She called to say she and Brett were planning a birthday celebration for me, early April, at their place. She had a tone she used sometimes that was very warm, the version of herself that had always made it hard to be angry with her. And she said she'd invited a few of our old friends, and she wanted to make a proper dinner. I said I would think about it. I hung up and looked at Harold. He said very quietly, "Don't go." And I said, "We have to." I know how that sounds. After everything I've just told you, I know. But here is what you have to understand. Harold and I, by that point, had spoken to the lawyer twice more. We had documentation. We had Gordon's account of the conversation and writing. We had the transaction records. The lawyer had advised us very carefully on our next steps. Going to that dinner, staying calm, not revealing what we knew. There was a reason for it that I can't detail fully. But it had to do with timing, and with making sure we were not the ones who gave her the opportunity to move anything, or disappear anything, before the right people were looking. So we drove out to Barrie on a Saturday in early April. It was cold, the way April can still be cold in Ontario, the sky low and white. There were no other cars in the driveway when we arrived. No friends' cars. Nora met us at the door. She hugged me. She smelled like her perfume, which I have known since she was a teenager. I hugged her back. I am her mother. The dinner was a roast, and it was good. Brett poured wine I didn't drink, claiming a new medication. Nora talked about a home renovation, the summer, some friends of theirs in Collingwood. She was bright and warm and funny in the way she could be when she wanted something. Harold sat across from me and ate and nodded, and I watched his face for anything that would tell me he was struggling. He was doing fine. Harold has always been steadier than he looks. After dinner, Brett suggested a walk. There was a ravine trail behind their neighborhood, he said. Good for the digestion. Good to get some air. Harold stood up immediately and said, "Sure." I looked at him. He looked at me. Something passed between us. We went down the trail, the four of us. It was dusk and cold, and the path was still soft from the melt. Brett walked ahead with Harold. Nora walked beside me, and she took my arm the way she used to when she was young, and I let her. Halfway along the trail, there is a place where the path narrows and the ground drops sharply to the left. The ravine is not deep, maybe a 7 or 8 foot drop to a rocky creek bed. Nothing like what you might imagine from a movie, but the bank is unstable and the rocks below are real. I had been there before, years ago, with Nora and Philip when they were teenagers. What happened in the next few seconds, I have gone over so many times that I no longer fully trust the order. Brett was ahead of Harold. Nora was beside me. I know that Brett turned and said something. I don't remember what. And then there was a movement, a hard one, and Harold went sideways off the path. He didn't scream. Harold is not the kind of man who screams. He went over the edge, and I heard him hit the creek bed, and then there was silence. I turned to Nora. She was staring at the edge of the path with an expression I have never seen on a human face before, and hope never to see again. It was not horror. It was calculation. Then she looked at me, and I understood, in the way you understand things that the rest of your mind hasn't caught up to yet, that this was not an accident. I don't know what I did in the next second. I don't think I thought. I stepped back from the edge and I said her name. She said nothing. Brett was moving toward me on the path, and I did something that I cannot explain as strategy or planning. I sat down hard on the ground right where I was standing, and I said very loudly, "I don't feel well." I don't know exactly why that stopped them. Maybe because it was unexpected. Maybe because a woman sitting down on a muddy path and saying she doesn't feel well is not the tidy situation they had planned for. While I was sitting there, I heard Harold's voice from below the bank. He said quietly, almost conversationally, "Lorraine, I'm all right. Don't move." The steadiness in his voice. I cannot tell you what that steadiness did for me. Brett said Harold's name loudly in a voice that was performing concern. Nora crouched down beside me and touched my arm and said she was worried I'd had a spell. We should get back to the house. She'd call a doctor. I said I needed a few minutes. My heart, the cold air. We stayed like that for long enough that Brett eventually went to the edge and looked down, and I heard him tell Nora in a low voice that Harold wasn't moving. I watched Nora's face. I watched her make a decision. She stood up, and she took out her phone, and she said she was going to call 911. She didn't. I know she didn't because I was watching her screen. She stood there for a few minutes, pretending. Then she told me she'd called. Help was coming. We should walk back to the road to meet them. She helped me up. She held my arm all the way back. Harold was found 40 minutes later by the paramedics who I called from the road the moment Nora and Brett were out of earshot. He had a broken wrist, 2 cracked ribs, and a deep cut on his forehead that needed stitches. He had lain still in the creek bed for almost half an hour in the cold, listening, making sure. He told me later that when he heard me say I didn't feel well, he knew exactly what I was doing, even though I hadn't planned it. 43 years of marriage. You know each other. I don't want to describe the legal process in detail because some of it is still, even now, not fully resolved, and I was advised not to discuss certain parts of it publicly. What I can tell you is that Harold had, over the preceding months, worked with our lawyer to prepare a very thorough document. He had recorded 2 phone conversations with Nora in which she made statements about our finances that contradicted what she had told us directly. He had Gordon's written account. He had the Respart transaction records. He had a summary from a licensed forensic accountant, a woman we'd found through a referral from our lawyer, that traced, as clearly as anything I've ever seen, the full scope of what had been moved, borrowed, and taken without permission over nearly a decade. The evening on the ravine trail was, as it turned out, the detail that made everything else significantly clearer to the people who needed to understand it. Philip flew in. He didn't ask questions about why, he just came. He and Harold drove to the lawyer's office together the Monday after, and June stayed with me at the house in Orangeville, and we sat in the kitchen, and June made tea, and we talked about Abby, and what we were going to do about the recipe H, and whether there was any way to make up what had been taken. There is, partially, not all of it, but some. The question I get asked when I talk about this is whether I still love her, whether I hate her, whether I understand how she became this person. The honest answer is that I don't know how to stop loving someone I spent 35 years loving before I understood what she was capable of. That love does not go away. It just becomes something you have to hold carefully at a distance, like something that was yours and is no longer safe to keep. I think about the little girl who used to fall asleep in the car on the way back from her grandmother's. And I think about the woman standing on that trail watching the edge of the bank, and I cannot make those two people fully the same person in my mind. Maybe that's a failure of understanding on my part. Or maybe it's just the truth of it, that people contain things we don't see, sometimes for a very long time, and that loving someone is not the same as knowing them. Harold has healed. His wrist took longer than the ribs. He does physio on Thursday mornings and complains about it in the mild way he complains about everything, which means he doesn't really mind. We sold the house in Orangeville last fall and moved to a smaller place in Owen Sound, closer to the water, which we have always loved. We did not give anyone our new address until we were sure of them. Abby turned 9 in February. We took her to the Science Center in Toronto for her birthday. Just the three of us, me, Harold, and Abby. And she spent 40 minutes in the space exhibit and came out with approximately 73 facts about Saturn that she repeated to us for the entire drive home. She is going to be fine. She is already fine, in the way that children are resilient in ways that shame the rest of us. I did not think when I was 40 that this would be the story of my 60s. But I also did not know at 40 how much Harold and I were capable of when it came to it. We walked out of that ravine. We came home. We told the truth to the people who needed to hear it. That is the whole of it. I keep coming back to the kitchen table in Orangeville. Not the night Harold told me everything, though that was the one that broke something open in me. I keep coming back to the first time, the first transfer, $20,000. The way I typed in the amount and told myself it was love. Maybe it was. But I think now that there's a difference between love and the willingness to look away, and for a long time I confused the two. What I understand now is that the people in this story got exactly what they had built toward, not because the universe was watching and keeping score, but because choices accumulate. Every time Nora took something and faced no consequence, she became more certain she could take more. Every time Brett stood beside her and said nothing, he became more committed to whatever they were building together. And every time Harold and I transferred money without asking hard questions, we made it easier for the next ask to feel normal. That's not blame. That's just how things compound quietly over years, until the morning you spread out a transaction history on the kitchen table and the numbers tell you a story you should have been reading much earlier. Harold knew something was wrong before I let myself know. That bothers me still, a little. Not because he was wrong to investigate quietly, but because I think I didn't want to see it. There is a kind of stubbornness in the heart that insists on the version of your child you raised, even when the evidence is asking you to look at a different version entirely. That stubbornness is not wisdom. I know that now. Real clarity, the kind Harold was building while I was still making excuses, requires you to look at what's actually in front of you, not what you wish were there. It requires patience and a willingness to be wrong about someone you love, which is one of the harder things I know of. And then there is what Harold did in that creek bed. Broken wrist, cracked ribs, cold ground, and he lay still and quiet and listened and waited. He did not panic. He did not call out in a way that would have told them he was conscious. He kept his head when everything around him was designed to undo a person. And I think about that often. Not as something exceptional, but as a reminder that steadiness under pressure is not a personality trait you either have or don't. It's something you grow over decades by doing the small, hard things consistently. Harold had been doing the small, hard things his whole life. When it mattered most, it was already there in him. I don't think of myself as someone who handled any of this with particular grace. I transferred money I shouldn't have. I made excuses I shouldn't have made. I went to that cabin in Barrie when a wiser woman might have found another way. But I sat down on a muddy path in April and I said I didn't feel well, and that small improvised act of presence, staying calm, staying grounded, not giving in to the panic that was absolutely there, bought Harold the time he needed. We each did what we could with what we had in the moment we were in. Abby is 9 now and she loves Saturn. That's what I come back to when the rest of it gets heavy. We told the truth. We protected what we could. We walked out. That's enough.